we are all in this together. So I want to do as Jeff did to highlight these very specific, horrible, and manifold attacks against trans people, but remind gay, lesbian, and bisexual cisgender people, don't fool yourselves.
Hi there. I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Chris Sanders, executive director of the Tennessee Equality Project, which advocates for LGBTQ rights in the state. I had a great conversation with him and Jeff Graham, executive director of Georgia Equality, for a Pride Month debriefing. Our conversation came just a few days after the U.S. Supreme Court decision in the Skrmetti case. So, of course, we talked a lot about that and the path forward for LGBTQ equality in the South. That's coming up later in the episode. Also, in our arts and culture segment, we'll highlight a few of the more dramatic and interesting ways we celebrate the 4th of July. But first, it's time for our news roundup. This week, we have some updates on issues and efforts we have talked about in previous episodes. Specifically, Texas does an about-face on its THC ban. Mississippi faces pushback over yet another anti-DEI law. And a group of southern states moves toward creating their own non-woke system for accrediting colleges and universities. As always, you can find sources and more information in our show notes. Last month, we talked about Texas's new law banning all intoxicating THC products derived from hemp. The Lone Star State has long banned marijuana, but the new law also shut down the manufacture and sale of hemp derivatives like Delta-8 and Delta-10. This put Texas at the extreme end of THC prohibition in both the South and the nation as a whole. It promised to derail a legal hemp THC industry that had already grown to $8 billion in the state, and which invested its resources heavily in trying to stop the bill, arguing for regulation rather than an outright ban. Those lobbying efforts appeared to have fallen flat with the passage of the bill, at least until last week when Texas Governor Greg Abbott announced he was vetoing it. Abbott had refrained from commenting on the legislation as it worked its way through, waiting until almost the last possible minute to exercise his veto. Coming after the legislature had already adjourned, his veto leaves no room for state lawmakers to override it. Abbott's reasoning was drawn straight from the hemp THC industry's talking points. He argued that the bill would face a lengthy court battle and said, quote, Texas must enact a regulatory framework that protects public safety, aligns with federal law, has a fully funded enforcement structure, and can take effect without delay. He has called a special legislative session starting July 21st to deal with several issues, including the development of new hemp THC regulations. The veto angered Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, the leader of the Texas State Senate, who had made the ban a top priority. He called high-THC hemp products, quote, a poison in our public. Patrick and Abbott are both conservative Republicans, and they are generally political allies. The rare rift on the issue suggests the special session will be combative. It also suggests that the legal THC industry continues to build power even in the South, which, as we discussed last month, has been the slowest region of the country to legalize any form of intoxicating cannabis. If the Texas bill had become law, it may have served as a rallying point for moves toward full prohibition elsewhere in the South. But if Abbott gets his wish of a defined, regulated marketplace for legal THC products, that also could be influential on the rest of the region. Polls consistently show that the Texas public is on the side of some form of legalization. A statewide survey just last week found that 53% of Texans opposed the ban on hemp-derived THC. And also last week, an East Texas dairy farmer named Bobby Cole announced his intention to run as a Democratic challenger to Abbott next year. Among his platform priorities, legalizing marijuana. All right, we talked not long ago about the way southern states have led the fight against what they call DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, at all levels of the public and private sector. Advocates for freedom of speech and public education have pushed back against those efforts in many places, and a new legal challenge is now underway in Mississippi. In June, a coalition of groups led by the ACLU of Mississippi filed a lawsuit against the state over a new state law that restricts the discussion of certain topics in the state's public schools and universities. As is usually the case with these laws, it positions itself as prohibiting discrimination in hiring and instruction on a range of characteristics, including race, sex, and gender identity. But as is also usually the case, its critics say it appears to be aimed mostly at silencing discussion of those issues at all. In particular, the lawsuit singles out a prohibition on, quote, diversity training, unquote, which the law defines this way. Any formal or informal education, seminars, workshops, or institutional program that focus on increasing awareness or understanding of issues related to race, sex, color, gender identity, sexual orientation, or national origin. The bill includes disclaimers that it shouldn't be interpreted to restrict scholarly or creative work by faculty or students, or to restrict protected First Amendment rights. But the lawsuit says that the law will inevitably lead to both of those infringements. It says, quote, history teachers will be banned from discussing slavery, the Civil War, discrimination in the past and present, the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage and women's rights movements, the LGBTQ rights movement, and many other aspects of American life and life throughout the world. The Mississippi law passed largely along party lines, and again, as is usual, most of the people voting for it were white men. The suit is the latest challenge to the anti-DEI wave that conservatives have been riding in recent years, which has been amplified at the federal level by the Trump administration. Other legal efforts have had some success. Last year, a federal judge in Florida blocked parts of Governor Ron DeSantis' signature Stop Woke Act on the grounds that they interfered with the free speech rights of private employers. A section of that law applying to state schools is still being contested in the courts. Other suits over similar state laws are already pending in Tennessee and Alabama. At the federal level, a California judge earlier this month blocked parts of President Trump's anti-DEI executive orders, likewise finding that they unconstitutionally restrict free speech. But conservatives in southern states aren't waiting for more court rulings on their anti-DEI education initiatives to take a potentially major step toward reshaping their colleges and universities. Last Thursday, in Florida, DeSantis announced the creation of a new accreditation body that could serve as an alternative authorizer for colleges and universities. The University of Florida system is leading the effort, and 5 other southern states are joining in. The university systems of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas A&M are all partners in the project. Universities must be accredited by federally authorized organizations in order to be eligible for federal funding and student aid. The accreditors set standards for academic rigor, management practices, student success, and other metrics. The primary current accreditor for schools across the Southeast is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges, known by its kind of funny acronym SACSCOC. As we talked about a few weeks ago, DeSantis has waged a vocal battle for ideological control of Florida's many public colleges and universities, installing an array of conservative political appointees with limited academic credentials as presidents and trustees. The move to create a separate accreditation organization that could potentially put its own ideological stamp on everything from course content to treatment of LGBTQ students appears to be an extension of that fight. The body would need to earn approval from the U.S. Department of Education, and DeSantis made clear that he wants to get it done during the term of President Donald Trump. According to the Florida Phoenix, DeSantis said, quote, "We didn't really have the prospects of launching anything like this successfully during the Biden years, but it's a new day, and I think this is going to make a big, big difference." He also made the point that once the new agency is established, it would be hard for a future administration to shut it down. He was joined at his press conference last Thursday by representatives from Texas and South Carolina, but not Tennessee. In a message to faculty, University of Tennessee President Randy Boyd took a softer tone than DeSantis. He framed the initiative as creating another option for accreditation, without committing to even using it. For what it's worth, SaxCock itself does not appear all that woke. Although the organization has a diversity, equity, and inclusion position statement on its website, it has resisted calls to set measurable diversity standards for the schools it accredits. It is, of course, hard to predict how far the university systems will really go in drawing up new accreditation standards. But if they do restrict diversity efforts in any way, that may not be disqualifying to the current anti-DEI leadership of the U.S. Department of Education. Okay, now we're to my interview with Chris Sanders and Jeff Graham. Both of them are the executive directors of statewide LGBTQ advocacy organizations, Sanders at the Tennessee Equality Project and Graham at Georgia Equality. I initially scheduled the interview to catch up with both of their respective states' recent legislative sessions and the overall status of LGBTQ rights in Tennessee and Georgia. But as I mentioned earlier, our conversation ended up being just 2 days after the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in the case of United States v. Skrmetti, in which the court upheld Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming medical care for minors. So, not surprisingly, we talked a lot about that and the broader context of the ongoing legislative attacks on trans people. Both of them argued forcefully that trans rights are inherently linked to rights for all LGBTQ people, and that all of those rights remain under steady legal assault. It is maybe a bit of a sobering way to close out Pride Month, but that's the reality of Pride in 2025. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. All right, joining me this week at the end of what has been kind of a tumultuous and I think difficult week for LGBTQ advocates and allies all over the country and certainly in the South, we have Chris Sanders, who is the director of the Tennessee Equality Project, which advocates for LGBTQ rights across the state. He has led the organization since 2013. And also on a side note, I think it's worth mentioning that he was a founding member of Nashville's very first gay rugby team. Don't know if you're still active in that.
No, I'm 55 now, so I could, but I probably wouldn't live much past 55 if I were. So,
and we also have Jeff Graham with Georgia Equality, which advocates for LGBTQ rights in Georgia. And Jeff has been active in LGBTQ advocacy really since the 80s and getting involved with AIDS awareness and activism. And I think I don't know how many years ago, but you were the Grand Marshal of the Atlanta Pride Parade, right?
Yes, yeah. I back in 2000 and again in 2016.
Wow. So. Which is one of the largest Pride celebrations and one of the oldest Pride celebrations in the South. So thanks again to both of you. And as I mentioned, we're taping this at the end of the week in which the Skrmetti decision came down from the Supreme Court. And so, Chris, because that case arose out of Tennessee, we have our Attorney General's name on it. I just wanted to initially get from you your thoughts on that, what you are hearing from people. I feel like this was probably not unexpected after the arguments in December. It seemed kind of clear where a lot of the conservative justices on the Supreme Court were leaning. But I guess how do you take this, and how are the people who you work with and work for taking this?
Even well before the decision this week, I think we could even start with the bill passed. Immediately, families, parents, and trans kids who had been willing to speak to the media stopped. And every time I get a call from a reporter now, which was frequent this week, about we want someone actually affected by the decision, I have to explain to them they don't think it's safe for them to identify themselves in the media right now. And if you read the comments, if you're still on Facebook and you read the comments when an an article is posted from a media outlet like, for example, WATE in Knoxville, you will see plenty of people say, you've got to understand these parents need to go to jail. And that's what families are up against. It's hard enough for a trans kid to muster the courage to begin these discussions with their parents and their healthcare providers. If the families and the doctors could just have that, there would still be difficulties, but that would be the way it ought to be. But now we've got all these threatening messages reaching these families, creating hell on earth for them, adding that layer of difficulty when the situation was already not easy. So I'm going to use that as my touchstone to describe what's going on. I mean, those conversations publicly were beginning to shut down from those directly affected right after the bill passed. But it's worse now. And of course, as Jeff can tell you, there are people who are staying and fighting, and there are plenty of people who are moving to other states who have the ability to do so because they're trying to protect their families. So those are two parts of the response I would highlight. I don't know whether that really gets at your question, but that's what I would want to lift up right now.
Yeah, and so Jeff, I know Georgia also restricts gender affirming care for minors, right?
Uh, yeah, our legislation passed 2 years ago, went into effect in 2023. We also have a lawsuit. We're in a separate federal district appeals court, so we're not quite sure. I think it's important to recognize. And first of all, Chris, I admire you, and I admire everybody in Tennessee for being there and continuing this fight, as hard as it is. And we really need folks like you to continue to do that. So I just really wanted to start off by acknowledging you, and the work that you've done, and the families and the people that continue to fight in Tennessee. So Jesse, back to answering your question. Ours is a little bit different. Ours right now only restricts, well, they all say that they restrict surgeries, which really does not happen most anywhere in the country, certainly not in these states that have these restrictions. Our restrictions right now are limited to hormone replacement therapy, and a grandfather clause was built into it that adolescents, and I use that word because, again, these are not young children. These are kids, uh, 14, 15, 16 years old, who have been on puberty blockers, have been in medical care, have been seen by teams, and evaluated to get to the point of hormone replacement therapy. Here in Georgia, our law allows those that had been on hormone replacement therapy to remain on HRT. Um, uh, if they were on before the law became effective on July 1st, 2023. So we've got a slightly different situation here in Georgia, but it also means that we've got legislation that so far we've been able to keep from passing, but would further those restrictions, so that it would be all care, to take away that grandfather clause. And like Chris had said, we do have families that have moved out of state if they have the ability, and a lot of our families have also stopped wanting to be public and speaking to the press. Luckily, a lot of them are still coming down to the Capitol, meeting with their own individual lawmakers. But yeah, it's this climate of hostility is one of the things that concerns me the most going forward, is that we just cannot take it for granted that this is also a personal safety issue for so many families and so many members of the transgender community.
Sure. Well, so thinking a little more broadly about the status of LGBTQ rights in these states, so much of the focus has been on trans issues in particular, in recent years. But, I wonder, we go back 10 years coming out of the Obergefell decision, there was this real sense. And I remember going to a celebration here in downtown Knoxville of liberation, of people feeling like, okay, we're there. That was a major step. It wasn't the only step toward full equality and rights, but it felt like that's where things were moving. We did have the Bostock decision come a few years later, which reinforced some level of rights and protections. But I guess how is the movement feeling? I think there was some sense maybe in 2015 that maybe the movement had won, and maybe people could relax a little bit. How are people feeling more broadly about even the rights that have already been secured? How secure are they? What's the mood? And I guess maybe Jeff, start with you.
Well, I think certainly you captured that state of euphoria in a decade ago, and frankly, it continued for several years. We did win a number of important Supreme Court cases. After that, I would even count some Supreme Court cases like Masterpiece Cake that said that people with religious objections to participating in even in very light ways like baking a cake, which is literally what that case was around, for same-sex couples, that their religious views needed to be taken into consideration, but the courts did not invalidate, and in fact strengthened state, local, and now federal civil rights protections in many ways. The Bostock case specifically around employment. We had an administration that was incredibly supportive with the Biden administration that took executive action to expand those even further. And so it is. It's a severe backlash that's going on, and there's a lot of fear. So similar to what we talked about for the parents of transgender kids, a lot of folks are concerned about what happens next. And what we're saying very broadly to the LGBT community is that we understand those fears, but we're hoping that folks will remain resilient and actually lean into our history as a movement. Because, as you said at the beginning, I started doing this as a college student in the 80s, and there was literally the height of the AIDS pandemic. There was literal death surrounding us. And even then, we were able to find our own ways of creating systems of care where none existed in the face of a hostile government that openly mocked and laughed at our deaths. We found resilience in laughter and humor and going forward and living our lives as a form of resistance, our joy as a form of resistance. Those are some of the history lessons that I hope we can bring forward in this time. And of course, just it's broadly LGBT folks that are concerned, but again, so much of the animus right now is directed at members of the transgender community, whether it's government documents, access to health care, access to opportunities, in school, restrictions of the usage of restrooms and other facilities. It's just a real hard time. And I hope that we're able to today talk a little bit about some ways that folks can resist that and can keep the hope that we may have future court decisions that go our way.
And I guess, Chris, are you hearing similar things in Tennessee?
Well, there was a brief period of celebration after Obergefell, but we've had an anti-marriage equality bill in Tennessee every year since then. In fact, the Tennessee Natural Marriage Defense Act was pre-filed in September 2015, before the legislative session began in January. We've had those bills every year since. There is an intensity of specialized bills attacking the trans community that really broke out here around 2016 with bathroom bills. And of course, bathroom bills are back again. But anybody who's gay, lesbian, or bisexual and cisgender should realize they never stopped attacking on the issue of sexual orientation. Uh, the flag bills that are introduced in many legislatures are also about gay, lesbian, and bisexual people as well as trans people. These marriage bills affect the whole community. The bills affecting school clubs affect LGBTQ, all the letters, students. It That's why I'm particularly frustrated by the very small minority of people who want to break off gay, lesbian, bisexual people from trans people. They fooled themselves into thinking that if we just didn't have to deal with gender identity issues, the movement would magically have everything it wanted. And that is not true. The Project 2025 people do not like any form of what they would describe as aberrant sexuality. And if you think for 1 minute that they are forgetting us, that's ridiculous. We are all in this together. So I want to do as Jeff did to highlight these very specific, horrible, and manifold attacks against trans people, but remind gay, lesbian, and bisexual cisgender people, don't fool yourselves. They are still coming for you openly, and they will absolutely dig in harder if they can disappear trans people from public life. They will consider that checked off and move on to us. So I'm sorry I went on that tangent, but it is a burr in my, I can't. It makes me very emotional when I see that small but vocal minority of people who want to break off. I just think that's ridiculous. Sorry about that.
No, that's a good point. And I was actually going to ask, kind of to that end, to what degree you're feeling some need to address that among your sort of ostensible political allies, because there has been a lot of talk since the election in last November among, especially sort of maybe centrist Democrats, that, well, maybe we got our party too involved with this whole transgender thing. And, you're starting to see people. There was just an article in the New York Times the other day about how it's sort of sense that, the LGBT movement pushed things too far. So when you hear that kind of talk, even from the one political party that, has more or less come along in support of gay rights more broadly, I guess, what's your response to that? And are you having to have any of those conversations with people who have been your allies?
What we subtly remind our groups every time they gather is the variety of the bills. So we've tried to head that off a little bit. Mostly people will not come to me to my face and say, I really think we ought to drop trans issues. But you see those discussions occurring online. But we try to head it off again by continually, when we talk about legislation, we try to make sure people know the whole community is targeted, and there are especially bad attacks against trans people. We both need to highlight who is being hit the hardest, which is clearly trans people, and remind everyone we're all being attacked. Now, that said, very occasionally there are some lawmakers who are either so-called moderate Democrats or even moderate Republicans who say, I'm with you on this, this, and this, but I can't go here. All your legislative alliances are provisional, in my view. I don't go around sticking the title ally on people. I look at it as an alliance. And alliances are partial, they're temporary, and they may allow you to beat one bill, but you won't get that person's vote on two other bills. So yes, we have those conversations, but we approach it as a lobbying organization, knowing that we're not going to get everybody on every bill. We will still argue our position. We're not moving on that, but the alliances will look different on different bills.
And do you have
Yeah,
similar conversations?
yeah, very, very, very similar to the experiences that Chris just mentioned. I, Georgia, because we are now currently considered a swing state when it comes to federal elections. For folks who've not been in it in Georgia, last year we were inundated, nonstop ads. I know that a lot of them bled over into to Tennessee since we share a border, just nonstop. Looking at transgender issues, specifically in the Harris campaign. Some of that has trickled down into testing the waters on legislative races, and it has led some of the Democrats that we have depended upon to walk on some bills. And actually, we had a handful of Democrats that voted in favor of legislation here in Georgia that restricted access to health care for transgender folks that are currently incarcerated in the state prison system. And what I have said to all of them when they say, well, I don't know how to explain this to my constituents. And I think it's actually a pretty easy talking point. And that is that they are proud of the long tradition of Democrats to stand up for the civil and human rights of all people, including those who are members of the transgender community. They must flat out reject this false narrative that somehow transgender folks asked for too much, too quickly. It angers me when people head down that path, because how can you, with a clear conscience, say that someone asking for basic dignity, access to health care, to be treated the same as their peers in any situation, that's asking for too much? That's very much akin to saying that the victim of domestic abuse asks for it by disobeying the wishes or setting off the abuser. It started as a small number of Republicans. It grows all the time that are using this misinformation, disinformation, outright lies for political gain. And it needs to be identified for what it is. That's the problem. Transgender folks are not the problem.
Right.
Parents
It
who will
baffles
do
me. I'm
anything to
sorry.
love their kids should be honored, not demonized. I'm sorry, Chris. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I interrupted. I'm sorry. I just, it baffles me that when someone doesn't understand something, now one of the first reactions is, what if we banned that?
Hmm.
And that's where we're headed with the far right. Uh, I don't understand it. I'm not going to bother to understand it. Oh, and let's ban it too. There's
Well, and
the live and let live element is disappearing.
obviously we saw that also this month with the Southern Baptist Convention voting overwhelmingly to make a priority of trying to get Obergefell reversed, and then I guess they would have to also get the federal law, the Marriage Protection Act that was passed, reversed. But they clearly are feeling their oats at the moment. So I guess for both of you, and Jeff, you were talking earlier about the things people can do. Um, what are those things? I mean, obviously, whatever sense people might have had that these fights are over and we won has been eroded. Where do you go now? Because this is a movement that has had victories, has had successes over time. I mean, it took decades, but has had real gains. So what are you doing? What are people on the ground doing to really try to engage for what's clearly going to be an ongoing struggle?
Well, first of all, it's recognizing that people's fear People's emotions are very, very real. I don't want to ever have folks feel that I'm discounting what is going on. If they need to step away, if they have the means to leave the state, more power to them. There is no shame in taking care of yourself. Uh, but not everybody can do that. And the folks that cannot need to stay and find ways of fighting, find ways of resisting. Like I said earlier, I mean, we as a broader community have been through this before. We have dealt with this hostility from government, and we eventually win. I think that we have to believe in the concept that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We cannot give up that sense of hope. We cannot give up that sense of resilience. I spent a lot of time Wednesday with listening to attorneys from around the country. Um, uh, that talked about the nuance in the Supreme Court decision. It was a horrible decision. It was horrible for kids. It was horrible for the transgender community. But I've got to remain hopeful, like those attorneys led me to believe that the arguments. First of all, we're respectful of the transgender folks. This is something that we don't often see in the debates happening at the legislature or in the public media, where it is so dehumanizing. I remain hopeful that if we see cases that look at this same issue from the aspect of parental rights, we've got a number of cases right now fighting back against these executive orders that are continuing to work their way through the system. The evening before the Skrmetti decision, there's now a national injunction on the ban against transgender folks being able to get passports that match their gender. So there's reasons that we have to keep that hope, but we also need to figure out, how do we make better use of telemedicine? How do we create the same ways that we got drugs to people living with AIDS in the 80s, when there was no federal system that allowed for that. Again, these are some of the things that we need to focus on, and we need to keep fighting them at the legislature. Ultimately, what the Supreme Court did yesterday, or on Wednesday, was not to issue a broad mandate that these bans should be put in place. It was actually deferring to states, which means we need to continue to invest in a state level struggle. And those state investments cannot go away. Even in the hard states, those state investments need to be there. People power, financial resources. We've got to continue to fight this in legislation. We've got to continue to create systems of care, and we've got to fight the politics by helping to defend and elect people who will ultimately not just defend these, but hopefully ultimately stop them and reverse them.
Obviously, I completely agree. And you could say that Jeff and I are biased because we lead state organizations, but part of the reason I think both of us have stayed with state level organizations for so long, and I was involved with the founding of TEP over 20 years ago, and I became staff in 2013. So we've both been in this a long time. If you prevent bad things at the state level, they don't get to the Supreme Court. And in both our states, even though some bad laws pass, many fail. Advocacy can work. It does not work in every single instance, but part of the reason it works is because we can see differences within the Republican caucus. There are true believers, there are opportunists who may not believe in their hearts much of anything, and there are those who go along, and there are those you can move. And if our constituents, our members, are not talking to their own legislators every year, we will not catch the wave as it changes. If we take a year off, we will probably lose 10 in the movement. We can't do it. And progress looks like a lot of different things. It may be convincing a legislator not to become a sponsor of a bill, or not to run it for the next month while there's some study, or not voting for it, or taking a walk, and finally moving them to voting against a bad bill. And I know Jeff and I are both invested in the nitty-gritty of those things that come with professional lobbying plus good constituent conversation with legislators again and again and again, year after year. And that's not sexy work, but it is beautiful work, because when people from around the state, either state, realize they can have a conversation with their own legislator and potentially be a first-time person having a policy conversation on that topic with them, they can shape the way a committee chair views a bill, a key member, and it does have an effect, and we've seen it beat bills over the years. Not as much as we would like, but enough that we're going to keep plugging away at it.
Hey. All right. Well, that's probably a good place to wrap up. The fight goes on, basically. Thank you both so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure I'll be checking in with you, because none of these issues are going to go away anytime soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jesse. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Jeff and Jesse. I enjoyed it.
This Friday is the 4th of July, so I thought I would mention a small, notable handful of the myriad celebrations taking place across the South. The holiday actually kicks off just a ways up the mountain from me. Gatlinburg, Tennessee will hold its 50th annual Midnight 4th of July parade right at the stroke of Independence Day. The parade starts at 12:01 a.m. on Friday and runs through the middle of the resort town in the Great Smoky Mountains, with floats, fireworks, and marching bands. It began in 1975 and has continued every year since, except for taking a year off during the COVID pandemic. Even older is the Thunderfest celebration in Bowling Green, Kentucky, which is marking its 54th year of providing fireworks and a festival environment. The headline musical entertainment this year comes from local boy Rowdy Shea, a country singer who appeared on a season of The Voice. In Florida, Panama City Beach takes advantage of its waterfront with not just one, but 4 separate fireworks shows over the course of 3 nights, July 3rd, 4th, and 5th. They call it the largest fireworks display on the Gulf Coast. And speaking of the Gulf Coast, in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, the 4th of July week is the occasion for the annual 3-day Crab Fest, organized by Our Lady of the Gulf Catholic Church. It will take place from July 3rd to 5th with live music, arts and craft vendors, and, of course, a whole lot of crab and other seafood. Over on the Atlantic coast, near the mouth of the Cape Fear River, Southport, North Carolina lays claim to a heritage of Independence Day celebrations stretching back 230 years. The first recorded 4th of July observation in the town was in 1795. It is now home to what is officially called the North Carolina 4th of July Festival, which draws 40 to 50,000 people each year to Southport, a town with a year-round population of about 4,000. Anyway, wherever you are and however you celebrate, have a great 4th of July. Fresh off the No Kings protests a few weeks ago, it seems like the holiday might have a little extra verve this year. And if it needs to be said, be safe and come back with all your fingers. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. If you do feel moved to make a donation, first of all, thank you. And second, make sure you make a note in the comments accompanying it that it is for the Progressive South. Thanks to Bark for our theme music and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. We'll talk to you soon.